Okay, so think about this for a second. Imagine being so, I don't know, intensely self-aware, so bogged down in your own thoughts, your own contradictions, that you feel completely cut off from, everyday life.
Hmm. Totally alienated.
Exactly. And then, what if you actually chose misery, chose irrationality over the kind of comfortable path of, well, what we think of as happiness and reason? What does that even look like inside someone's head?
That's precisely the really fascinating, maybe uncomfortable place we're diving into today. And our guide is, well, one of literature's most notorious figures.
Right, the narrator from Fyodor Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground.
Yeah, and we're specifically digging into excerpts from part two, the section called Apropos of the Wet Snow.
This is where he shifts, right, from the sort of philosophical ranting in part one.
Exactly. He starts recounting these specific, often painful stories from his younger days that, well, they really illustrate this bizarre worldview he's laid out.
So, our mission here, really, is to try and unpack this character, understand his, let's say, radical critique of society's view of human nature.
And, why he insists so strongly on the value, maybe even the necessity of things like caprice, suffering, chaos,
Yeah.
even when it clearly harms him.
We're trying to pull out the key insights he offers, however challenging or contradictory they might feel.
Definitely. So who is this guy? The narrator himself gives us some basics right up front.
Yeah, he tells us he's 40, took early retirement from the civil service, lives totally alone, and his self-description is quite something.
So he really doesn't pull any punches, does he? He calls himself spiteful, a scoundrel.
Oh,
What else? Oh, the nastiest, stupidest, absurdest, and most envious of all the worms on earth.
yeah. Quite the introduction. He mentions something physical, his liver, but then quickly says that's not the real issue.
Right, that's just a throwaway line, almost.
Yeah.
He pivots immediately to what he sees as his actual problem, this overacute consciousness.
Over acute consciousness.
Yeah, he argues that having too much awareness of himself, of others, of all the world's absurdities, it's not a gift, it's a disease, a genuine misfortune, maybe even the greatest misfortune,
It paralyzes him.
completely. And you see this right away with his whole relationship with spite. It's fascinatingly contradictory.
He claims he was spiteful back when he was an official, right?
Yeah.
Taking pleasure in messing with petitioners, getting into that ridiculous feud with an officer over sidewalk space.
Yes, the famous officer on Nevsky Prospect. We'll definitely get back to that incident. It's quite revealing. But the key thing here early on is that he makes this claim about being spiteful.
But then it immediately takes it back.
Exactly. He says, no, I was lying. I wasn't really spiteful. I was just sort of amusing myself. And the real kicker, is the shame he feels.
But not shame for being spiteful.
No, shame for his lack of genuine spite, for being filled with all these opposite elements, pulling him in different directions. He can't even be properly spiteful.
Which kind of leads into his feelings about what he calls direct people, the men of action.
He has this deep contempt for them. He sort of envies their ability to just act.
But he despises them, too. Why is that?
Well, in his view, their ability to act comes directly from their, quote, stupidity and limitation.
Ouch.
Yeah. He thinks they can find an infallible foundation for what they do, only because they mistake secondary causes for primary ones. They just don't see the endless web of complexity and contradiction that swamps him.
So they can just go for it.
They can just go for it. And this inability to find a simple primary cause, it leads him to this really powerful symbol.
The wall. And twice two makes four.
Exactly. These represent the absolute unshakable laws of nature, of reason, of arithmetic, things you just can't argue with on their own terms.
He knows you can't literally break through a stone wall if you're not strong enough. You can't rationally disprove 2 + 2 = 4.
Right. But here's the core Dostoevskian insight, channeled through this character. His humanity, his freedom, lies in his refusal to be reconciled to these facts.
Even though he can't change them.
Even though he's powerless against them. He dislikes these laws simply because he dislikes them. It's defiance purely for the sake of defiance. It asserts his will over impersonal fact.
And maybe the most visceral example of this defiance is his idea about finding enjoyment in toothache.
Oh, that's a really unsettling passage, isn't it? He talks about finding this perverse pleasure in the sheer humiliation and agony of a toothache.
It's not just the pain.
No, it's the awareness of the pain, the wallowing in it. He describes making these malignant moans, not just out of pain, but to sort of consciously perform his own degradation, his helplessness against nature, against his own teeth.
And that awareness, that self-conscious suffering becomes a kind of twisted pleasure.
A voluptuous pleasure, he calls it. It's a way of asserting his consciousness, his self, even within the experience of being completely subjected to pain. It's deeply paradoxical.
Which, of course, flies directly in the face of the idea that humans are purely rational creatures seeking only their own advantage or happiness.
Absolutely. He directly attacks that idea that we only act in our own real normal interests. He puts forward this radical notion that sometimes, maybe even often, a person's advantage must consist in desiring something harmful or irrational.
Because there's one key advantage that all the rationalists and the sages miss.
Yes, the overlooked advantage. And what is it? It's one's own free, unfettered choice, one's own caprice, however wild it may be, one's own fancy worked up at times to frenzy.
That's the most important thing to him.
That's the most advantageous advantage. It breaks all the systems, all the classifications. The core insight here is that humans will prioritize acting simply as they choose, driven by whim, by will.
Not just by what seems reasonable or advantageous, according to some calculation.
Precisely. And he just rails against the scientific thinking of his day, the idea that free will is an illusion, that we're all just determined by natural laws.
Like piano keys or organ stops.
Exactly like piano keys. He hates that analogy. He argues reason is just one small part of this, the will. That's the manifestation of our whole life, including all the messy, irrational impulses.
And the insight is that we might deliberately choose something stupid, something harmful.
Just to prove we can. Just to assert our right to desire it, whatever it is, to protect our personality, our individuality, our fundamental freedom to be unpredictable, even to ourselves.
He even looks at history as proof.
Yeah, he says, look at world history. Does this look like the work of rational creatures? All the bloodshed, the chaos, Napoleon, for instance.
And he makes that really chilling point about civilization not making us better, just maybe more sophisticated in our cruelty.
Right. He says it hasn't softened man, it's just given them a greater capacity for variety of sensations, which unfortunately includes finding pleasure in violence. He uses Cleopatra sticking pins in her slave girls as an example.
And he argues modern people are worse because they do terrible things knowing they're terrible. It's not ignorance, it's a conscious choice.
Which he sees as more degenerate, yeah. And this leads him to critique the idea of a perfect, rational future society.
The Palace of Crystal.
The Palace of Crystal. This gleaming symbol of a world built entirely on science, reason, calculation, everything efficient, predictable, like a giant, perfect ant heap.
And his reaction is just pure disdain.
He says it would be frightfully dull. And here's the insight. He suggests that in such a perfectly ordered world, sheer boredom would probably drive people to irrational, destructive acts.
Like sticking gold pins into things just to make something happen.
Exactly, just to smash the predictability, to assert their unpredictable will against the perfect system.
Which connects to his idea that maybe humans actually love chaos and destruction a little bit.
Or at least they fear the alternative reaching that final, finished, predictable state, like the ant heap.
So the insight is it's the process that matters. The striving, the becoming, not the arrival.
Yes. He loves the process of the game, not the end. Reaching that final goal, that absolute certainty that twice two makes four state. For him, that's the beginning of death. It kills the dynamic, messy, contradictory thing that makes us human.
And tying this all together is his really bold claim about suffering itself.
It's a cornerstone of his thinking. He states it flatly. Suffering is the sole origin of consciousness.
Wow, the sole origin.
The sole origin, and while he admits consciousness is often a misfortune, a disease.
He still wouldn't trade it.
Never. He says man prizes it infinitely, wouldn't give it up for any amount of satisfaction, no matter how nice the Palace of Crystal looks on paper.
So the final really profound insight from this whole philosophical part is that consciousness, born from pain and contradiction,
Is infinitely superior to twice two makes four. It's messy, it's difficult, but it's the source of our individuality, our awareness. And that's more valuable than any cold, predictable fact or comfortable certainty.
Okay, wow. That's a lot to take in. We've got the core of his defiant, uncomfortable philosophy.
Deeply uncomfortable, yeah.
So now let's pivot to part 2, apropos of the wet snow, and see how these ideas actually play out in his life. These anecdotes he shares from when he was younger, around 24.
Right, and he paints this picture of himself back then. Gloomy, utterly solitary, avoiding everyone. consumed by this toxic mix of intense vanity and crippling self-loathing.
Swinging wildly between thinking he's superior and being absolutely convinced everyone despises him.
Yeah, leading to this constant paralyzing fear of looking ridiculous.
You really see that at his office job. He hated his colleagues, was sure they hated him. He tried so hard to look like he didn't care, to seem lofty, expressive, extremely intelligent.
But was always convinced his face just looks stupid. He even talks about doing these weird little experiments with eye contact,
Yeah.
trying to stare people down, and always failing.
He calls himself a coward and a slave in those moments.
But then adds, maybe that's just how a decent man has to be in their time. Another little dig at society.
And this self-loathing and need to assert himself brings us back to that officer on the Nevsky Prospect.
Right. This wasn't just a minor annoyance for him. He becomes completely obsessed with this officer who just doesn't move aside for him.
It fuels this internal furnace of rage, all based on perceived humiliation.
The whole anecdote just perfectly illustrates his desperate, almost pathetic need to assert his dignity, to prove he's not just a fly to be brushed aside. He even plans the confrontation, the collision, meticulously.
And the collision itself, when he finally deliberately bumps into the officer, even though he gets knocked back himself, it feels like a victory to him.
Bizarrely, yes. In that moment, he feels he hasn't yielded. He's stood his ground, put himself on an equal social footing, symbolically at least. He feels fully avenged. But then, true to form, a few days later, that feeling completely evaporates and he's just filled with shame again. It shows that whole cycle. Defiance, perverse triumph, and then the inevitable self-laceration.
He also talks about escaping into dreams, right?
Yeah.
Especially after periods of, well, vice or dissipation.
What? Yeah, these aren't just normal dreams. They're incredibly vivid, elaborate fantasies. He's a hero, he's noble, forgiving everyone, finding the sublime and beautiful everywhere.
Riding a white horse, crowned with laurel.
All of it. He sees himself only in these extremes. Absolute hero or groveling in the mud. There's nothing between.
And the insight there is how these fantasies function for him.
They're a cloak, he says, for the mud of his real life. A necessary escape valve for his intense vanity and self-loathing, fueled by the gap between his idealized self and his sordid reality.
He makes an interesting detour at one point to talk about Russian romantics.
Yeah, and it feels very much like he's describing himself, or at least the type he identifies with.
How does he describe them?
As people who understand everything. They're pragmatic, even strategic about getting ahead in the world, pensions, status, all that.
But internally?
Internally, they hold on to this pristine ideal of the sublime and the beautiful, but they never let it actually touch their real actions. They keep it separate.
So they can be cynical operators but still feel noble inside.
Exactly. He says they can be the worst rogues but remain extraordinarily honest at heart. It's another perfect example of those opposite elements warring inside him.
And lurking beneath a lot of this is what he calls his secret vice.
He describes engaging in it furtively, at night, alone, always accompanied by this gnawing shame and self-disgust.
And that feeds the need to hide away.
Absolutely. That secret life, steeped in shame, is a huge part of what fuels his retreat into the underground, away from judging eyes, into his world of thoughts and fantasies.
Okay, so that sets the stage for the main narrative of part 2, the disastrous dinner invitation.
Right. He's feeling utterly alone, miserable, and he basically decides to crash a farewell dinner for an old schoolfellow, Zverkov.
He knows they don't like him, right? He sees it in Simonov's reaction.
Oh, clearly. He knows Ferfitchkin is insolent towards him, but he forces himself to go anyway. Why?
Partly spite, maybe? Partly to prove he isn't completely defeated?
And partly, perhaps, just a desperate, perverse need for some kind of human contact, even if it's guaranteed to be painful.
And thinking about the dinner brings up all these awful school memories.
Yeah, being this lonely, quiet kid, mocked mercilessly for being different, hating his classmates for their crudeness, their obsession with success and status, snug berths, he calls them.
He tried to make friends, but admits he failed because he was a tyrant at heart. He wanted to dominate, not connect.
He even drove away the one boy he did manage to subjugate. It's a bleak picture.
So predictably, the dinner itself is just excruciating.
Utterly humiliating from the moment he arrives. He's late because they basically forgot to tell him the right time. He has to awkwardly borrow money to pay his share.
And they just lay into him insults about his cheap clothes, his appearance, his low salaries, Zverkov's condescending, Ferfitchkin's sniggering.
It's just relentless social torture. He feels completely crushed and humiliated.
But does he leave? Of course not.
No, he stays. Out of pure perversity, Digging himself deeper, he starts drinking heavily.
Leading to that drunken meltdown.
Yeah, wanting desperately to insult them all, challenging Ferfitchkin to a duel, which they just laugh off. Then this sudden, tearful, abject apology.
But the pendulum swings again. The apology turns into something else.
Shame fuels a new, almost feverish resolve. He has to follow them. They've gone on ahead, presumably to a brothel.
And he decides he must go there too. For what?
To either force them to beg for his friendship, recognize his worth somehow, or, failing that, to slap Zverkov across the face, to finally assert himself physically.
Oh, he runs off into the night.
Runs through the wet snow, his mind just a chaotic storm.
Yeah.
Self-pity, grandiose comparisons to literary heroes like Pushkin, waves of shame, but underneath it all, this burning focus. The slap. No force could stop it. It's madness.
And he arrives at the establishment completely worked up and encounters Liza.
Right. And his first reaction is disturbingly cold. He feels this kind of silent gratification that she's just an object for him, someone beneath him he can observe.
But then, almost instantly, something shifts.
A completely different impulse takes over. He decides he needs to save her.
So he launches into this speech.
This incredibly dramatic, moralizing lecture, painting these vivid, awful pictures of her future, dying alone of consumption, buried in filth, forgotten.
And contrasting it with these very sentimental, idealized images of happy family life, little babies.
Yeah, little rosy baby boy, I think he says.
Yeah.
And he's quite self-aware about it later. He admits he was using these pictures quite deliberately to manipulate her emotions.
But he also insists he spoke with real feeling.
Yes, that's the Russian romantic again, isn't it? The performance mixed with genuine, if fleeting, emotion. And his vanity is so fragile, he feels personally wounded if she doesn't react exactly the way his script demands.
But Liza, she does react, genuinely.
She does. You see her affected. She shows shame. Her manner softens. Her voice changes. She actually leaves his performance, his promise of something better, and gives him her address.
Cut to the next morning, predictable reversal.
Oh, absolutely predictable for him. He wakes up instantly filled with regret and self-loathing, hating his womanish hysteria, his sentimentality from the night before.
He curses himself, curses Liza.
He was utterly terrified that she might actually show up in his dismal apartment. He dreads her seeing him in his real state, his shabby dressing gown, his squalid room, maybe overhearing him arguing with his servant, Apollon.
Because that would shatter the illusion.
Completely. It would expose his true, beggarly, loathsome self, destroy the hero persona he tried to project onto her, reveal him as a fraud. That's the insight, his absolute terror of exposure.
He says he's more ashamed of his poverty than almost anything else.
More afraid of it than of being found out if I were a thief. It's that intense. And he has this chilling realization. If she sees him like this, he will never forgive her for it.
Which explains what happens when she does arrive.
It fuels his most calculated act of cruelty. He just unloads on her. I lied to you. I was just playing with words. I wanted to humiliate you. I want you all to go to hell. I'm a blackguard.
And he knows it's cruel.
He explicitly says it was affected cruelty, a product of the brain of books, not genuine rage from the heart. It was a performance designed purely to wound her, to push her away, born out of his own unbearable shame.
But Liza's reaction throws him completely off balance.
Totally. Instead of reacting with the expected shame or anger or hurt pride, she sees through his performance to the miserable man beneath, and she shows him pity, compassion. She cries for him.
And how does he react to that?
This genuine human connection, this unexpected compassion, it doesn't soften him. Instead, it sparks this feeling he identifies as mastery and possession, which he then immediately calls hatred.
Hatred for pity.
It's incredibly perverse. The insight is his fundamental inability to handle genuine reciprocal emotion. He admits even his fantasies about love were always about a struggle ending in moral subjugation. He just doesn't know how to receive love or pity without feeling threatened or needing to dominate.
He realizes she came looking for something real.
Yeah, he gets a glimmer of it, that she came seeking actual love, salvation, not just his fine sentiments. But he concludes he was just too damaged, too out of touch with real life to understand or accept it.
So his final act towards her
Is to push money into her hand as she leaves,
the 5 rubles.
reducing it all back to a transaction.
Exactly. A final, calculated insult to demean her, to erase the moment of genuine connection. He admits it was done purely from spite, a cruel thing purposely, straight from his evil brain.
And then the final contradiction.
He immediately regrets that too. He runs out after her into the snow.
But stops.
He stops, realizes he doesn't know where she's gone or even really why he's chasing her. He has this fleeting impulse to fall at her feet, sob, beg forgiveness.
But instantly undercuts it.
Instantly thinks, wait, wouldn't I just start hating her tomorrow because I kissed her feet today? He recognizes, in that moment, his own toxic pattern. He knows he can't offer her happiness, he'd only make her suffer more.
It's a devastating self-awareness. He sums up the whole story himself, doesn't he? He does. He calls it a corrective punishment. A story that reveals how he fundamentally spoiled his life through morally rotting in my corner, his complete divorce from real life, fueled by that rankling spite.
But then he takes it a step further.
Yeah, he sort of universalizes it, suggests maybe we are all divorced from life, we are all cripples in some way, preferring life in books, in theories, in abstractions.
And makes the claim that he's actually more alive than others.
Precisely because he takes his contradictions and suffering to such an extreme, while others, he thinks, just deceive themselves or settle for comfortable illusions.
Wow. Okay. Spending time inside that head is
Yeah.
it's definitely an experience. He throws down this incredibly radical challenge, doesn't he, to the whole idea that humans are fundamentally rational, that we just seek comfort or advantage or happiness.
He really does. He elevates all the messy, painful, irrational stuff, consciousness born from suffering, the absolute need for free will and caprice, the defiance against certainty. He elevates that as being more vital, more essentially human than any kind of sterile logic or predictable contentment.
And reading about his extreme case, it absolutely forces you to look inward, doesn't it? To ask how much of our own striving for the rationale, the predictable, the comfortable, our own personal palace of crystal, maybe how much of that is genuinely what we desire.
Right, and how much is driven by external pressures, by social scripts, or maybe just by deep fear of the kind of chaos and uncertainty that he, in his own twisted way, seems to embrace.
It leaves you wrestling with his really haunting question near the end. We don't even know what leaving means now. Leave us alone without books, and we shall be lost and in confusion at once.
Yeah, so for you, the listener, when you step away from the books, the theories, the expectations, what does it actually mean to truly live? Is consciousness, with all its capacity for pain and contradiction, ultimately a blessing, or, as he sometimes feels, a curse?
He insists suffering is the sole origin of consciousness and that people prize it too much to give it up. Is there truth in that for you? Where do you land on that?